A grocery store, present day. Fluorescent lights hum over a shelf stacked with squat blue and yellow cans. A young man picks one up, turns it over, snorts, and puts it back with a joke about mystery meat that his friend laughs at. It's one of the most reliable punchlines in the American supermarket, the can everyone recognizes and almost nobody respects. Shorthand for cheap, processed, faintly ridiculous food. It's also, right now, sitting in your email inbox in a completely different form. Every unwanted, unsolicited message clogging your junk folder is named directly after this exact product. A joke so total that most people under 40 have no idea the word spam ever meant anything else. Here's what almost nobody standing in that supermarket aisle knows. This exact can may have helped defeat Adolf Hitler, not as a metaphor, not as a joke. By the end of the Second World War, the United States military had purchased more than 150 million pounds of it, and the company making it was shipping 15 million cans a week overseas at the peak of the war. It fed British families through the harshest years of wartime rationing, so much so that a future prime minister would later call it a wartime delicacy. It fed Soviet soldiers fighting and dying by the millions on the Eastern Front, so critically that the man who would go on to lead the entire Soviet Union once admitted, in his own memoirs, that his country might not have been able to keep its army fed without it. General Dwight Eisenhower, the man who commanded the invasion of Nazi-occupied Europe, personally wrote a letter after the war thanking the company that made it, while also confessing that he, like millions of soldiers under his command, had said more than a few unkind things about it in the field. This is the story of Spam, a boring solution to a meatpacking company's inventory problem in Minnesota that somehow ended up feeding armies, saving nations from starvation, reshaping the cuisine of entire Pacific cultures, and, almost by accident, giving the internet the exact word it still uses today for everything nobody wants to see in their inbox. To understand how a can of pressed pork ended up doing all of that, you have to go back to a problem that had absolutely nothing to do with war and everything to do with a very unglamorous cut of meat nobody wanted to buy. It's 1937, in Austin, Minnesota, inside the offices of the George A. Hormel and Company meatpacking plant. J. Hormel, the company's president and the son of its founder, has a problem sitting in cold storage, an enormous surplus of pork shoulder, a cut of meat that consumers of the era simply didn't want on their dinner table. Tough and awkwardly shaped compared to the cuts they preferred. J. Hormel had spent years pushing his company to expand beyond fresh meat into canned products, partly inspired by what he'd seen German meatpackers doing on a trip abroad after the First World War, and partly out of Depression-era necessity. Canned meat, unlike fresh meat, didn't need refrigeration, didn't spoil on the shelf, and could reach customers who couldn't easily get to a butcher. His team's solution was almost embarrassingly simple. Grind that unwanted pork shoulder together with a little ham. Add salt, sugar, water, and a touch of sodium nitrite to preserve it. Seal it inside a rectangular tin, and sell it as an affordable, shelf-stable alternative to fresh meat. They called it, at first, Hormel Spiced Ham. It needed a better name. Picture the scene at J. Hormel's own New Year's Eve party, sometime in the late 1930s. 65 guests mingle through his home, and Hormel has turned the evening into a contest. Name the new product. Win $100. Guests have to purchase each round of drinks by scribbling entries onto slips of paper, and as Hormel would later recall with a laugh, along about the third or fourth drink they began showing some imagination. Late in the night, a butler delivers one final slip to Hormel. On it, a single word, Spam. It came from a Broadway actor named Kenneth Daigneault, whose brother happened to be a Hormel vice president. Whether the entry was a stroke of genius or a stroke of good champagne, nobody has ever fully settled. Hormel liked it immediately. Some say it was meant as a contraction of spiced ham. Hormel Foods itself, to this day, keeps the true origin cheerfully vague, claiming only a small circle of former executives really know for certain. Either way, on July 5, 1937, Spam officially hit American grocery shelves for the first time. By 1940, roughly 70% of American households had tried it. Nobody involved had the faintest idea what was coming next. On September 1, 1939, Nazi Germany invaded Poland, and within 2 years, the entire logic behind J. Hormel's shelf-stable canned pork would be turned into something far more consequential than a Depression-era grocery convenience. President Franklin Roosevelt signed the Lend-Lease Act on March 11, 1941, authorizing the United States to ship food, fuel, and equipment to Britain and, later, the Soviet Union, even before America had formally entered the war. And almost immediately, military planners on both sides of the Atlantic recognized that Spam solved a logistical nightmare no other meat product could touch. It didn't need refrigeration on ships crossing submarine-infested oceans. It didn't spoil in the heat of the Pacific jungle or the freezing mud of the Eastern Front. It could sit in a warehouse, a foxhole, or a rucksack for months without going bad. And a single company in Minnesota could produce it at a scale no traditional butcher ever could. By the time the guns finally fell silent in 1945, the U.S. Army alone had purchased over 150 million pounds of it, and Hormel had reoriented much of its wartime production specifically to keep the Allied war machine fed, at points shipping some 15 million cans overseas every single week. Picture a Liberty ship crossing the North Atlantic in the winter of 1942, zigzagging to dodge German U-boats, its cargo hold packed floor to ceiling with identical rectangular tins. Below deck, sailors and dock workers stack crate after crate, knowing that a single torpedo strike could send the whole shipment, and the men guarding it, to the bottom of the ocean in minutes. This wasn't a luxury item making its way across a dangerous sea. It was calculated, essential cargo, judged as critical to the war effort as fuel or ammunition, because an army that cannot eat cannot fight. And in 1942 and 1943, keeping 3 separate Allied nations fed across 3 separate war fronts was one of the single hardest logistical problems of the entire war. In Britain, already gripped by strict wartime rationing that limited families to a few ounces of meat per week, Spam arrived through Lend-Lease as an unrationed lifeline, quickly working its way into ration-stretched kitchens across the country. Decades later, Margaret Thatcher, who had lived through the war as a young woman, would look back and call it, without irony, a wartime delicacy, high praise for a product that in peacetime most people would never have described that way. But it was in the Soviet Union where Spam's wartime role became almost impossible to overstate. When Nazi Germany invaded the USSR in June 1941, it rapidly occupied the fertile agricultural regions of Ukraine and southern Russia, the exact breadbasket territory the Soviet military and civilian population depended on for food. By early 1943, American food shipments, Spam prominent among them, accounted for roughly 17% of all calories consumed by Red Army soldiers, alongside half of all the fat in their diet. Staggering numbers for a foreign product shipped across a war zone by a country that, for the first several months of that shipment, wasn't even formally in the war itself. Picture a Red Army mess tent somewhere near Stalingrad in the winter of 1942. Temperatures plunging so far below freezing that rifle oil thickens and skin can freeze to metal in seconds. Soldiers huddle around a cooking fire, carving open a tin stamped with English lettering none of them can read. The meat inside pink and glistening, utterly unfamiliar, and utterly welcome. Decades later, Nikita Khrushchev, the man who had served as a senior political commissar embedded with Red Army forces at Stalingrad and Kursk before eventually rising to lead the entire Soviet Union, would write in his memoirs, with startling bluntness for a Cold War leader crediting an American product, "Without Spam, we wouldn't have been able to feed our army." It's one of the most remarkable lines in the entire history of the product, delivered by a man who had commanded political affairs at some of the deadliest battles in human history, admitting, on the record, that a canned meat product from Austin, Minnesota, had played a real part in keeping his soldiers alive long enough to eventually break the Wehrmacht on the Eastern Front. American troops, meanwhile, developed a far more complicated relationship with the product, feeding them on nearly every front of the war. In the Pacific Theater especially, where fresh meat was almost impossible to keep from spoiling in the tropical heat, Spam became a near-constant presence on GI mess trays, fried, boiled, sliced cold, mixed into whatever else was available, served so relentlessly, meal after meal, month after month, that soldiers began inventing bitter nicknames for it. Ham that didn't pass its physical, meatloaf without basic training, and worse. J. Hormel himself, a First World War veteran, took the complaints in stride, reportedly remarking that if soldiers thought Spam was bad, they ought to have tasted the bully beef rationed out to troops in the previous war. After the war, General Dwight Eisenhower, the Supreme Allied commander who had personally overseen the Normandy invasion, wrote a letter to a retired Hormel executive that captured the entire love-hate relationship in a single paragraph. During World War II, of course, I ate my share of Spam, along with millions of other soldiers. I'll even confess to a few unkind remarks about it, uttered during the strain of battle, you understand. But as former Commander-in-Chief, I believe I can still officially forgive you your only sin, sending us so much of it. That's the strange, almost contradictory legacy sitting inside every can, complained about constantly by the very men whose lives it helped sustain, and credited by leaders on both sides of the emerging Cold War, with genuinely helping win the war those men were fighting. It is difficult to think of another food in modern history that carries both of those reputations at once, resented in the foxhole, praised at the highest levels of government, mocked in supermarkets today by people who have no idea it was ever anything else. And nowhere did that wartime relationship transform into something deeper and stranger than in the Pacific. When Japan attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, Hawaii instantly became one of the most critical staging grounds in the entire Pacific War, and within a few years, more than 400,000 American troops would pass through the islands. Fresh meat, already a challenge to supply to an isolated Pacific archipelago even in peacetime, became nearly impossible to guarantee during a war fought largely by ship, and local fishing itself was restricted for military security reasons. Spam filled the gap. Military shipments arrived by the ton, and soldiers, flush with more canned meat than they could eat, began bartering surplus cans directly with island residents desperate for reliable protein. By 1945, Hawaii was consuming an estimated 3.5 million pounds of Spam a year, embedding it so deeply into daily island life that unlike almost everywhere else the product touched during the war, it never actually left once the fighting ended. Picture a Hawaiian kitchen in the years just after the war. A Japanese-American mother slicing a can of Spam into thin strips, frying them until the edges caramelize, and pressing them onto small blocks of vinegared rice wrapped in a strip of dried seaweed. A direct, deliberate fusion of the Japanese rice ball, onigiri, with the one reliable protein the war years had made universally available. That dish, Spam musubi, would go on to become one of the most recognizable pieces of modern Hawaiian food culture, sold today in nearly every convenience store and lunch counter across the islands. The scale of the relationship that followed is almost hard to believe. With a population of roughly 1.5 million people, Hawaii today consumes an estimated 7 million cans of Spam a year, nearly 5 cans for every man, woman, and child on the islands, by far the highest per capita consumption rate anywhere in the United States. The islands even host an annual festival in Waikiki called Spam Jam, drawing tens of thousands of attendees to sample everything from Spam sliders to Spam-flavored macadamia nuts, a wartime survival food turned full-blown cultural celebration. A strikingly similar story unfolds an ocean away, on the Korean peninsula, a decade later, born out of a very different kind of desperation. When the Korean War tore across the peninsula between 1950 and 1953, it left much of South Korea's economy and food supply in ruins. Destruction so severe that later analysts would compare its scale to the devastation of the Second World War itself. Near the city of Ujeongbu, just north of Seoul, where American military bases clustered after the armistice, Korean civilians facing genuine starvation began gathering whatever surplus and leftover food they could obtain from U.S. Army mess halls. Spam, hot dogs, canned beans, processed cheese, foods with no place whatsoever in traditional Korean cuisine. A Korean cook named Hae Gi-suk, who worked inside one of those American bases by day, began taking the leftover meats home and experimenting, eventually stir-frying them together before finally simmering the mixture into a full stew, enriched with the deep, salty base of Korean anchovy broth, and, soon after, the fire of kimchi and gochujang. She opened a modest restaurant in Ujeongbu built around the dish, and budae jjigae, literally, army-based stew, was born. A direct, edible record of a nation rebuilding itself, quite literally, out of American military leftovers. For years afterward, South Korea's government, wary of American cultural influence and economic dependency, actually restricted the legal import of American processed foods like Spam, which only pushed the ingredients for budae jjigae into a thriving, semi-underground black market run partly through connections at U.S.-based post exchanges. It wasn't until the 1980s that a Korean company began legally manufacturing its own version of Spam domestically, finally bringing the dish's central ingredient fully out of the shadows. Today, budae-jjigae is one of the most beloved comfort foods in South Korea, still often served with a slice or two of spam bobbing in the same spicy broth that Hyeogi-suk first improvised out of wartime scarcity. A dish born from hunger and occupation that Koreans have long since made unmistakably, proudly their own. So by the second half of the 20th century, this one Minnesota meatpacking product had helped feed the Red Army through the darkest years of the Eastern Front, become a permanent fixture of Hawaiian identity, and been reinvented as a beloved national comfort dish in Korea. And then, almost as an afterthought, it did one more thing nobody at Hormel could ever have predicted. It gave its name to one of the defining nuisances of the entire digital age. On December 15, 1970, the British comedy troupe Monty Python aired a sketch on their television show Flying Circus, set inside a greasy roadside cafe. A couple walks in and asks the waitress what's on the menu. She begins reading it aloud, and nearly every single item, no matter how the couple tries to order around it, includes spam. Egg and spam. Egg, bacon and spam. Spam, egg, spam, spam, bacon, and spam. In the background, a group of Viking patrons begin chanting the word over and over, louder and louder. Spam, 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 lovely spam, wonderful spam, until the chant completely drowns out every other line of dialogue in the scene. The sketch was a 3.5-minute joke about a canned meat product being so relentlessly, inescapably present that it swallows an entire conversation whole. Nobody involved in writing it had computers or electronic mail anywhere in mind. 2 decades later, engineers and early internet users on chat channels and online bulletin boards, drowning in an entirely new kind of unwanted repetition. The same unsolicited message, posted again and again, flooding out every other conversation in a chat room, reached for the exact image that sketch had burned into an entire generation's memory. By the early 1990s, spamming had become informal internet slang for exactly that kind of disruptive, repetitive flooding. The term exploded into mainstream use on April 12, 1994, when 2 American immigration lawyers, Lawrence Cantor and Martha Siegel, posted an advertisement for their firm's services to roughly 6,000 separate discussion groups simultaneously, an act widely credited today as the true birth of the commercial junk email industry as we now know it. From there, the word never looked back. By some estimates, unsolicited spam email would eventually come to make up as much as 90% of all email traffic sent worldwide at its peak. Hormel Foods, to its credit, never tried to fight the association head-on. The company has stated publicly that it doesn't object to the lowercase word spam describing junk email, so long as its own product keeps its trademarked capital letters SPAM on the can. A 3-minute sketch about a diner menu, built entirely around a product invented to solve a 1937 pork shoulder surplus, somehow ended up naming the single most universally understood annoyance of the internet age. Which brings the story to today, to a product with one of the strangest, most contradictory reputations of anything sold in a modern grocery store. Since 1937, Hormel Foods has sold more than 8 billion cans of spam across 40-plus countries, a product line that has expanded over the decades into more than a dozen varieties, from teriyaki to jalapeno to reduced sodium, still manufactured at the same Austin, Minnesota facility where J. Hormel first solved his pork shoulder problem nearly 90 years ago. There's a spam museum in that same small Minnesota town today, drawing visitors curious to see the full arc of the story for themselves. And the product still occupies 2 completely separate cultural universes at once, mocked, in much of mainland America and across the English-speaking internet, as the definitive symbol of cheap, mysterious processed food, its very name synonymous with unwanted digital clutter, while simultaneously treated, across Hawaii, the Philippines, Guam, Okinawa, and South Korea, as a genuine, beloved culinary staple, folded into rice, kimchi, eggs, and noodles by cultures who inherited it not as a punchline but as a literal wartime lifeline that never stopped being useful once the guns went quiet. So the next time you see that squat blue and yellow can on a store shelf, or delete another batch of unwanted messages from your inbox without a second thought, remember what's actually sitting behind both of those moments: a Depression-era solution to unwanted pork shoulder that ended up feeding the armies that defeated Hitler, sustaining a starving Soviet military just long enough to turn the tide on the Eastern Front, reshaping the food culture of an entire ocean's worth of islands and peninsulas, and finally, almost as an accident of a British comedy sketch, lending its name to the exact word the whole world now uses for everything it never wanted in the first place. Spam never set out to be a punchline, and it never set out to help win a war. It just happened to be the one thing, in a century full of shortages, that never ran out.